Yeah. All right, John Glenn, you are live. Take it away.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to our Recovery and Grace class. We're going to start a new class this evening. I have with me Tom Bimbo, one of the elders in the Church of the Woods, also Bill Lloyd, who you all are by now familiar with, the teacher of the Alpha series and so on. But I want to start a new class tonight that I simply call Recovery and Grace. Now, the 12 steps of AA, the AA program, describe what I see as a lifestyle of grace and truth. And that's why this step study is not just going to be a regular AA type of step study. I'm going to try to expand it a little bit so that it includes everyone. Far from being just simply a useful program for recovery for addicts and alcoholics, the 12 steps provide us with a spiritual model for change. We're gonna take that spiritual model for change apart. It's a change from the inside out that occurs when God works in us, as He does in an alcoholic or addict. So there's no doubt the 12 steps have helped millions of people across the world and the globe over the years that it's been established. Since the 1930s. It is the premier faith-based recovery type of program, if you will, and it continues in existence today. It does a tremendous job. And so I don't want in any way take away from the 12-step program or the 12 steps of AA, but I want to connect that program, recovery program, with the gospel of grace revealed as we've already studied in the Alpha series, and I want you to see the synergy between the two. This came about for me personally a number of years ago when Alpha Ministries actually took over a halfway house in the Fort Pierce area, and we began to teach sincerely a group of men who were seeking recovery from drugs and alcohol. And I began to use not only the 12 steps, but began to use the Alpha series as well. I had a fellow teaching the 12 steps on the Monday evening class. And I think even Bill Lloyd was at the time teaching the Alpha series on a Thursday evening class. And after watching that happen for a while, of course, Tom was involved in that as well. It was Martin and John Hales and a few others. But after watching the guys when they were going through the two simultaneously, that is, they were getting the Alpha series every week, they were getting the 12 steps every week, I began to see a synergy develop. A synergy that, in my estimation, was much more powerful than either the Alpha series by itself or the 12 steps by themselves. And so it's that synergy that I'm looking for in this class. I call it Recovery in Grace. It will go through, we'll use the format of the 12 steps, but we'll be adding to those 12 steps a bunch of other information and correlating with the biblical principles of the gospel of grace as well. Now, tonight, I want to just give you a quick overview of the 12 steps themselves. I'm not going to take a lot of time with them, and the classes that follow, we'll back up and we'll pick up steps 1 through 12 and spend a focus each night on a particular step. But for tonight, I want you to see the program as a whole. The first 3 steps actually concern our relationship to God. Admitting in step 1 that we are powerless over whatever it is that has caused our lives to be manageable. Now, for those suffering from addiction, that can be alcohol, it can be drugs, but there are other forms of addictions that we don't normally think of as substance abuse. For instance, there's sexual addictions, food addictions. There's also retail shopping addictions. There's a whole host of other things that we can become powerless over that can control our lives to the point that our lives are unmanageable. One of the concepts I'll be speaking on next week concerns the fact that we are powerless over our own flesh. And what I mean by our own flesh is just simply all of that sum total of conditioning we've had all our lives to save ourselves in some way, and the conditioning we've had to make ourselves feel good or look good. And we realize that that flesh leads us to an unmanageable life. Step one, we come to the place where we have to admit that we are powerless. And we'll talk more about that later. Step two follows right on the heels of step one. We come to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Now, it goes without saying, if you're being restored to sanity, you're pretty much insane to start with. And that includes part of that unmanageability of our lives. But the key there in that step we'll be emphasizing is the exercise of faith. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves, outside of ourselves, could restore us to sanity. That essential faith is absolutely necessary, not only for recovery, but for a relationship with God. And we'll be distinguishing between the kind of faith that we often see that does not work. I call it a toxic faith that is religious in nature, and the true, authentic faith that serves as a base of spirituality. That leads to step three, in which we simply make a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understand it. Now, those first three steps, and particularly step three, we have come to experience what's commonly referred to in the religious world, in the spiritual world, as a conversion experience, or being born again, if you will, or what AA simply refers to as a spiritual awakening. In essence, this is the beginning of a personal relationship with God. And of course, that personal relationship with God is absolutely essential for us to be able to be free from the bondage of our own selfishness and our own dysfunction. Now, at this point, the 12 steps switches focus from our relationship to God, more or less a vertical relationship between us and God, to our relationship with ourselves. It turns inward. In the fourth step, we are concerned with our motives, making a searching and fearless moral inventory. And that means we got to get honest. The biggest thing about this step is honesty. Honesty first and foremost with ourselves. We've got to be real. We've got to be transparent. We've got to be honest. We're going to talk a lot about, when we get to the fourth step, we're going to talk a lot about what it takes for that honesty step. We simply make inventory. We see all the things that are wrong, our shortcomings, our failures, our weaknesses, all of that sort of thing, our resentments, bitternesses, all that sort of thing that we've carried around as baggage in our lives. The fifth step, we actually confess or agree with God, ourselves, and another human being the exact nature of those wrongs and those difficulties that character defects and so on that we've discovered in the fourth step. Step six, we become entirely ready to have God remove that junk. Now, being entirely ready to have Him is a little more than what it just sounds like when you read it. And we'll talk a great deal about in step six what it's going to take for us to be entirely ready to have God remove all of that junk from our lives. Step seven, we humbly ask Him to remove it. We call on God and His power to get rid of the nastiness and the junk we've been carrying around in the flesh. So that pretty much describes our relationship to ourselves and the work that's necessary for us to get healthy regarding our own identity and our own lives. At this point, our attention shifts now from ourselves to other people. You see, a relationship really that we have with God is a vertical relationship. And then we have a relationship with ourselves, and that prepares us for a relationship with others. And so now we turn in the 12 steps to our relationships to others. Again, we're going to make a list of all the people that we have harmed, all the people that we have hurt. Now, our concern here is not so much trying to figure out the right or wrong of it, but to recognize and deal with the fact that we've hurt other people in our unmanageable lives, that we've caused them pain, that we have in some way blamed them or excused our behavior by them in some way. But this has caused pain to other people. And so we're going to make a list of those folks we feel like we have damaged throughout our lifetime with our lives being unmanageable. And then step 9, where God leads us, where it's feasible, and we'll talk a lot more in detail about that when we get there, we're actually going to make amends with those people. So, and what we're doing in steps 8 and 9 is what I refer to as turning the relational corner. We have established a relationship between us and God. And now we are turning the corner to establish our relationship with others. It's not a relationship in which we are receiving. It's not a relationship in which we are taking. It's a relationship in which we are giving. We are actually loving other people. This is a radically different type of relationship that we're used to. So instead of trying to make ourselves look good at the expense of others, we are willing to honestly consider ourselves and make it right with them. Again, it's an act of love. Now, the steps that remain are sometimes referred to as the maintenance steps, because once you've been through step 9, you're pretty much in recovery. And that recovery is a healthy place for you to be. But how are you going to maintain that recovery? How are you going to continue that recovery for the remainder of your life? Well, step 10 tells us that we're going to have to continue to take an inventory of our lives. We're going to have to continue to look at ourselves and not only take a look to evaluate our own actions, feelings, belief systems, and so on a daily basis, but we're going to promptly admit when we're wrong. You see, recovery is not about being perfect and not making any mistakes. Recovery is not about reaching a sinlessly perfected lifestyle. That's not recovery at all. That's a delusion. Recovery is when you're able to recognize when you've made a mistake and promptly admit it and draw on those tools that we've developed from the first 9 steps to deal with those mistakes. What keeps us going in that is step 11, where we, through prayer and meditation, actually are looking for God to lead us. We want, through prayer and meditation, to actually understand what God, through His Spirit, is leading us to do on a daily basis for the sake of loving others. Now, we're allowing ourselves then to be controlled by the Spirit of God on a continuous basis. In step 12, having had a spiritual awakening because of everything we've been through and because of these steps, because of these exercises of faith and so on, we are now going to seek to carry this message, a message of recovery, to others around us. And we're going to practice these principles in our lives on a daily basis. Step 12 becomes vitally important to maintaining recovery because of the orientation of caring about other people. See, the healthiest way we can live is to actually love other people, just like Jesus did. That's why we're here. That's why we were left on this earth in the first place, and that is to love others. So step 12 is a vital component of the 12 steps of this new lifestyle. Now, I call this, again, recovery and grace. I call it what we're learning is a lifestyle of grace and truth, as opposed to a lifestyle of rules, laws, and lies and deception, especially deceiving ourselves. And it is a recovery process for all of us, whether we're addicted to drugs or not, whether we're engaged in substance use disorders or we've had struggles with that or not. We all have issues of the flesh that we are going to have to learn to deal with. So the 12 steps of AA is really a practical description of the miraculous way that God changes us from the inside out, conforming us to the image of his Son. The founders of AA made it clear that such changes were not possible without divine intervention, by referring to recovery as being simply what God has done for us, we could not do for ourselves. Looking at these steps from a grace perspective allows us to see them as a beautiful expression of the gospel applied to very difficult life-controlling problems common to all of us. In so doing, we discover a tremendous source of hope, regardless of how desperate our situation may be. The lifestyle of grace and truth is a lifestyle of recovery. And so I welcome you to our class. I'm glad you all could join us here tonight. And keep in mind that we'll be coming to you live every Tuesday night at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. For those of you living in other time zones, we'll be doing this live, but it stays on YouTube or it stays on Facebook as a recording that you can go anytime to and refer back to. So at this time, what I want to do is bring in Bill and Tom. I want them each to give their own testimony concerning their walking out their lifestyle of grace and truth and how the 12 steps has impacted them. So Bill, let's start with you first.
All right. Yeah, I had I came to Florida in 1993, and I was led to Family Worship Center where John Glenn was teaching, and I got to know a lot of the different people in the fellowship. And John was working with Faith Farm and Dunklin at that time, and there were a lot of people in recovery that knew of John's teaching throughout South Florida that were coming to Family Worship Center. And I got to know the people that were the 12 steppers, so to speak, within the fellowship. And they definitely had something that I want. And as time went on, I met men like Bernie DeCastro and his bank robber friends up there, all working the steps. And I definitely began to see my need and how, just how performance-based, how religious I really was in my thinking and my approach with God. And they definitely had something that I wanted. So I asked a guy who came to the Alpha class. His name was Billy Precious. And I asked him to sponsor me. I said, will you bring me through the 12 steps? I didn't know of a lot of meetings or anything. And he said, yeah. And he said, what are you not willing to give up to get healthy, to get better? And I told him, and I lost those things, by the way. But we began to work through the steps. And he said, what I see right away, Bill, is that, you've been a Christian and you've skipped over step 1. You kind of did step 2. Step 3, you're trying your best to do. Step 4 and 5, you don't even looked at that. He says you're trying to do step 11 and 12 without, and that's kind of like my Christian life was fragmented. And like you were saying in the introduction, John, the Alpha series, I think the Alpha series is especially needed, especially when you have to do that inventory, because that inventory is really getting honest about your flesh, and that's a scary thing. And I noticed that in a lot of classes, people drop out after step 4, just like they drop out after you deal with hatred in the Alpha series. So as we began to go through it, I found some immediate relief just by admitting that I was powerless, and coming to believe that, I didn't come to believe right away that God grace would really restore me. But I remember the moment when it kind of dawned on me that God had it all. And as we went through and when we got to step 4 and 5, those were huge for me. And when we talk about it in the actual steps, I'll go more into detail. But it definitely was something that filled in a lot of gaps and was a tool that God used, to grow me spiritually.
Man.
And to this day, sometimes when I'm all gummed up and slimed up in my emotions and my gears are stuck, I go for a long walk and I just go through the steps. I talk to the Lord about each step, and usually there's a lot of freedom in that.
Yeah, that's one of the things about it we'll bring out in the class is that these steps are not just, I know it sounds like they're just events, sequential events, where you do step 1, then you do step 2 and step 3 and so on. But actually, every step you add, you do them all. In other words, the goal is to be able to do all 12 steps all the time. So when you're gummed up and you go on your walk, that's what you're doing. You're going through the whole thing at the same time. So
Yeah.
that's a good observation. Tom, how about you? What was going on from your experience with the 12 steps?
Well, as far as my personal experience with the 12 steps, I had been involved with Alpha Ministries for a long time and had been through the Alpha series many, many times. And then I went through a period of time in my life where about 20 years ago, where my family relationships were very threatened. The stress of my marriage and raising my kids and my profession and my business rather overwhelmed me. And as a result of it, I got some counseling and got some help, and then started on the road to recovery. With that, on the road to a healthy lifestyle, basically living out a life of grace and truth as best I could. And as you say, it's a learning process where every day you basically have to incorporate everything. So as part of that process, as I was getting a little better, I had the chance to start teaching the Alpha series in a men's recovery program for alcohol and drugs in Okeechobee in a halfway house setting. And later on, as you mentioned, we went into Fort Pierce as well. And basically, I asked the program director, I said, hey, I know these guys are going through the 12 steps and I'm not familiar with that. So, I need to understand that a little better, because my problem was not alcohol and drug related. It was other issues. So I started reading the book, and the first night I sat down with the big book of AA, I started just devouring it, and I could just see myself page after page after page through that book. And I came from a long line of alcoholics on my father's side of the family. My grandfather was an alcoholic back in Ohio about the time that the big book was being written, and he died after 30 plus years of sobriety from alcohol. And then my father followed, and he died after 35 years of sobriety of alcohol. So I thought, well, I can really see myself in this book. And my grandfather was an alcoholic, and my father was an alcoholic. Maybe my problem is I'm an alcoholic, because I drank, but it never seemed to be that was my life controlling issue. But I did go through a period of time where I was a little confused on whether or not I was alcoholic, and I was concerned about it. And the Lord finally set me free of that. But the one thing that did not change was this lifestyle of sobriety. I'll call it just a healthy lifestyle, so that we're not confused. So sobriety, healthy lifestyle, and trying to live that. And just, John, you used the word synergy earlier with the gospel, and synergy with the Alpha series, and I found that to be very true. And just like the Alpha series is a step-by-step format that we discover our identity and who we are in Christ. Also, the 12 steps is a step-by-step format. And again, it's not like you go through the 12 steps and you graduate. You're constantly having to include those 12 steps in every aspect of your life. But just to break it down into 3 sections like you did, those first 3 steps being really focused on our personal relationship with God, which is also the early parts of the Alpha series are very focused on that. And then those middle steps, those 4 through 7, are really focused on learning to live a lifestyle of grace and truth. And I mean learning to live a lifestyle of grace and truth. But what I find very fascinating and to me is the last 5 steps of the 12 steps, which are virtually almost half of the steps, are all involved with relationships with others, specifically learning how to love other people like Christ. And I've noticed people going through the 12 steps feel so free after those first 3 steps, and then they go into that learning the lifestyle of grace and truth, and they struggle, and because it's difficult, the honesty that's required. But if they keep on working it, and they find themselves at step 7 and think, wow, this is just so fantastic. What could be better? And then the next huge obstacle hits them is that as they're reaching that point in their recovery and they're going back and they're dealing with their past or they're dealing even with their present, I found that nothing threatens the continuation of your sobriety or the continuation of living a healthy lifestyle more than relational difficulties, and a small handful of people for each one of us. So it's really important that we continue all the way to the end and deal with those relational challenges, so that they don't set us back and take us back. So we will be offering, I know, a class. We're going to call it. We might call it the Relational Empowerment Series, and then we changed that to the Relational Ministry Series, and finally. John came out with a great book that just really embraces that whole series called Power to Love, and I'm sure that we're going to be offering that to the world, the internet world, as we complete this Alpha series that we're in now and the 12 steps. So I'll toss it back to you, John, on that.
Yeah, it's we've got a lot in store, a lot of good things that are coming down the pike here. You mentioned the 2 critical places, I think, Tom, in recovery, in the soul process of recovery. Bill, you too talked about the fact that when you get to that 4th step, you got to be honest about all the junk. You got to be honest about your resentments, and you got to be honest about your fears and all of that sort of thing. Unless you know that you are not your flesh, that you are a brand new person in Christ, no one really has the courage to do an effective job on step 4. And so part of the synergy is the way the gospel is tied in to the 12 steps. It makes it much, much more powerful. The other critical place we'll be talking about is when you turn that relational corner, because you can have this wonderful relationship with God. You can have a lot of goosebump experiences with God, but when it comes to dealing with your neighbor, when it comes to dealing with your boss, when it comes to dealing with your wife who still looks at you as unmanageable, when it comes to dealing with your kids, there's a whole new set of challenges there. And we'll be integrating those steps, particularly the last 5 steps, with the Power to Love book and with the series we call Relational Empowerment. So there's a lot of ground to cover in the future. I just wanted to give an overview this evening for you folks who are listening to us, and want you to know that recovery is possible. There is a new lifestyle of grace and truth, regardless of what pit you've been falling into or struggling in the middle of. There's a way out, and God stands ready to deliver us all. So with that, I want to close my section here tonight. I do appreciate everybody following along. You might mention a few of the followers there, Bill.
Yeah. We got who's Well, we got Tammy. She's there. We got Federico. He's in Central America or South America somewhere. Colombia, right, Federico? He'll tell.
I think Columbia.
Colombia? Yeah. Bobby Joe. Debbie Hollingsworth. Sherry Spain. I hope you got your volume going, Sherry. And Laser. Grandma. Praying for us, Cindy. Rodney.
Ann's all the way out in Colorado. She's my aunt. Good Ann.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No fooling.
I didn't even have to pay her to watch.
Yeah. It's only what, 5 o'clock out there.
Yeah.
I know there's probably a lot of other people on YouTube and stuff. And he's from Texas. Texas is the house. John, I wanted to ask one question before we close.
Okay.
Being that we run with a lot of people that are approach the lifestyle of grace, this is the pushback that I've gotten. Well, the 12 steps is a work. It's performance based. It's not grace based. How would you answer that?
Well, I think, the first thing was obviously they need to read the big book, but especially the testimonies. But just in brief, what I would say is the term step suggests that there's an initiative on our part to take a step. And so what the 12 steps of AA is really looking at is the responsibility side that we have in terms of our faith. It's not a matter of works that we're doing, it's a matter of faith. And I think point will become clear as we go through this. Secondly, the term step, unfortunately, conveys the idea that, it's something we're going to do. We're going to get better. We're going to turn over a new leaf, and I will never drink again, or I'll never do drugs again, etc. And unfortunately, none of that ever works. We know that from the testimonies in the big book and our own personal testimonies, but people take it that way just because of the terminology, I think, more than anything. But as we go through the series, we'll see that this is actually a description of how God is working in us in our response to that his working in us for recovery. So it's not, strictly speaking, an effort or work on our part at all.
Good. I wanted, that was something that was on my mind because I've gotten that. And like you said, I mean, I hear that, and most of the time it's the same people same type of thing when people criticize the Bible and you ask them if they've read it. Have you ever read it? Yeah. So thanks for clearing that up. We have a couple more people that checked in. Jim and Candy. Federico said yes, he's in Colombia. And that's about it. I know there's a lot of other people. So just a couple of announcements. We'll be continuing the Alpha series this Thursday night at 7 and Friday at 4. We're not going to do Saturdays now that the beaches and the intercoastal and people are going fishing and the beauty parlors are back open. So we're going to do Friday and Thursday and Friday. We're in chapter 10 this Thursday at 7 o'clock. So tune in for that. And John, you'll be meeting on Sunday.
Yes, we've got Church in the Woods going Sunday morning, 11 o'clock. We are trying to stay safe. And so, we want people to be led by the Spirit to come in the first place, which we want you to do that anyhow, whether you're worried about COVID-19 or not. But want you to be led by the Spirit and let God tell you what he wants you to do. But you're more than welcome to come. We have church at 11 o'clock. We've got plenty of room out here, We got about 40 acres we can spread out on here. So, you know, you're safe as far as that goes. We're outside. We're not all clustered up together. So, but we're continuing our study in Romans. And I'll be addressing kind of a controversial subject right now out of Romans chapter 13. What does it mean to be subject to the higher powers, the powers to be? You know, and what is that in relation to civil disobedience? And what if you have a tyrannical government and all that kind of thing? So we'll be studying that coming up Sunday.
All right. All right, everybody, you got it. See you on Thursday. Same Grace channel, same Grace place.